For now, we'll start our event. And then first, we'll invite David Faber, who is the co-director at CCRC and distinguished professor at Keio University, to start the opening remarks. Dave, please.
Welcome to our Cyber Civilization Research Center conference. This has been 4 years since we established the center at Keio University, and it's been an exciting 4 years, and hopefully it'll be an exciting future. The purpose of CCRC has been to look at the future of cyber civilization in a broad sense, both from a technological standpoint, a societal standpoint, a governance standpoint, etc. We have a lot of associated faculty within Keio University and other places within Japan. And we have a board of advisors, international board of advisors, and many fellows of the center. I will keep things short. Welcome, and we look forward to future activities with you. And with that, I'll turn back to Cherry to keep the meeting going. Cherry, it's all yours.
Thank you, Dave. Next, we'll introduce our keynote speaker, Mike Nelson. He is the senior fellow at CCRC and also the senior fellow at Technology and International Affairs Program, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sherry, and thank you very much, June and David, for inviting me to be here today. I've been a fellow at the CCRC for almost 4 years, and unfortunately have not yet been able to come to Japan to visit with you there. So I'm glad for the miracle of Zoom. I'm very honored to be here to talk about the future of cyber civilization and the ways in which we can influence how the internet and the cloud of things will evolve, and how these technologies will fundamentally change society over the next 8 years. I'm going to focus on the time between now and the year 2030. I'm not going to talk about 2040, and I'm not going to talk about next quarter. Throughout my career, I've been the futurist in the room. I've been the guy trying to focus on where we're going and how we can make decisions today to enable a better tomorrow. I've been working on digital policy for more than 30 years. That's not quite as long as June and Dave, but it's a very long time. And during that time, whether I was working in government or the private sector or in academia, I've been guided by the mantra that we used to use in the White House when I worked with Vice President Gore and President Clinton. It's a very simple mantra. It was really a version of the Hippocratic Oath. When it comes to internet policy, first do no harm. We tried whenever we could to enable new opportunities and not close down options. And it's worked pretty well. Over the last 30 years at the White House, at IBM, at Cloudflare, and now at Carnegie Endowment, I've really done a lot to stop stupid things that could hinder the development of the internet and limit its potential. And fortunately, I was not alone. People like Dave and June and a lot of people, particularly technologists, worked very hard to make sure there was room for innovators and internet users to find new ways to use the net and the web and the cloud. Over the last 30 years since we've commercialized the internet, we faced a lot of very critical choices about internet standards, about online censorship, about privacy, cybersecurity, e-commerce, and e-government. And at least in the US and Japan, most of the time we made the right choices. And when we realized in a few cases that we had done the wrong thing, the courts or the parliaments fixed it. So that has enabled the internet to grow from fewer than 1 million users 30 years ago to half the world's population. So we have to keep making the right decisions. So far, we've developed e-business, video conferencing, global digital libraries that give us access to almost unlimited amounts of music, movies, and cultures. But there's even more to come. I like to talk about the cloud of things. You know, what happens when each of us have 100 devices that interact with the cloud and are collecting data that we can use to be safer, healthier, and to enjoy a better life. So for the last 30 years, we've been doing the right thing. Policies have enabled the internet to grow up and expand to become one of the most important infrastructures, every bit as important as electricity. But right now we're facing a lot of very, very stupid proposals that could hold back the internet in fundamental ways. They could limit what we do. They could limit what new applications are developed. And most importantly, they could discourage investment in the new opportunities that could otherwise be there. Often these proposals are being put forward by policymakers and CEOs for good reasons. For instance, they want to protect our children online. They want to help us track down terrorists. In other cases, we have CEOs and politicians who are trying to limit the internet for very selfish, in some case, profit-driven motives. In other cases, they're trying to censor the internet and ensure that their political opponents don't use it. Regardless of the proposal, too often we're seeing very simple sounding laws and regulations that unfortunately end up having all sorts of complicated, unintended, and often harmful effects. So we have to constantly be asking, is this really what we want? And is this really necessary? Is there another better way to ensure that the internet meets our needs while providing opportunity for innovation and new applications? I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about all the stupid proposals. That would be a 2-hour lecture at least. So instead, I'm going to focus on the really thorny questions that have to be addressed. These are fundamental questions. These aren't questions like, should President Trump have been banned from Twitter? Much more important than that. So let me go through these. I have 6 of them. I'm not using slides today, but if you go to Twitter, you can find a thread that I just posted that pre-tweets these questions and lets you vote on which ones you think are the better choice or the most likely choice for the future. Just go to Mike Nelson on Twitter and you'll see 13 tweets that summarize my talk. In addition to framing these questions, I'm also going to talk a little bit about what happens if we make the wrong choice. And in some cases, countries have already made the wrong choice, and we're seeing what happens. So let me say, first of all, these aren't all choices that will be made by politicians and policymakers. Some of them will be made by business leaders. Some of them will be made by technologists and researchers. And some of them will be made by users. Users will decide which version of the internet they want if we've enabled many different choices to develop. So let me start with the toughest thorny question. This is the one that I was handed the first day I was on the job in the Clinton White House, January 21st, 1993, and that was encryption. 29 years later, we are still struggling to address this question. So the choice is actually pretty simple. The choice that I'd like you to vote on is, in the year 2030, will we have end-to-end encryption? Will governments be promoting end-to-end encryption for all data everywhere? That's option 1. Option 2, or will governments limit the use of encryption so that law enforcement and other government agencies can track our activities online? Or option 3, will we pursue both conflicting goals at the same time and keep arguing about why it's not working? What happens if we don't choose, if we have confusion about policy, is a lot of underinvestment. If we don't accept encryption as a key part of the information infrastructure we're building, there'll be a lack of cybersecurity, and there'll be a lack of trust, which will result in a lot of lost opportunities, things that won't happen because users don't want to have their every bit of data vulnerable both to government surveillance and to hackers who find a way to intercept their traffic. I should say as an advertisement that the Carnegie Endowment did an exceptional report on encryption 2 years ago. It's the Carnegie Encryption Working Group. And there are a lot of good side white papers on what this problem is really about. So the second question is one I'm very actively working on now, and that is the Splinternet. We all know that the internet was born global. It's really designed not to have national boundaries, and it's been very hard for those people who want to impose national boundaries on this global infrastructure to do so, but they sure are trying. And that is really going to hold us back. The magic of the internet has been that one little group of 4 or 5 people sitting in a garage somewhere can reach a global audience, and in a few weeks can be providing a service to millions of people. My favorite example of that is the very current one called Wordle, which went from having no users to being sold to the New York Times yesterday for millions of dollars. So again, this is the choice. In 8 years, will we still have a global internet that allows all apps to work everywhere? Or will the internet fragment? Will we have people following the Chinese model and the Indian model where they block hundreds of foreign apps and websites, where small companies can't use the global cloud services, whether from Amazon or Microsoft or European companies? So really the question is, will we have a global internet or a lot of little national internets? Third question is a little more complicated, but it's fundamental. It's about broadband regulation. As I mentioned, only about half of the world is connected to the internet, and even fewer people have a reliable, affordable connection. So how do we get more reliable, better, cheaper access? Well, there's a lot of demand, particularly since the COVID crisis. We've seen a 40% increase in the amount of traffic as people were working from home. But unfortunately, in too many countries, governments have realized there's a problem and taken the wrong approach. In many countries, the approach has been to pour hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars into the pockets of the largest network companies and try to build out the infrastructure that way. That's option one. Option two is to instead providing targeted subsidies to the users who are having a hard time getting connected. So it's a bottom-up subsidy rather than a top-down subsidy. Then, of course, there's option number three, which many countries have been pursuing, which is try something new every 3 or 4 years and completely distort the market, provide all sorts of perverse incentives, and discourage innovators who might want to invest in more interesting new ways of connecting people to the internet. The fourth thorny question is by far the most emotional digital policy challenge, and that is data protection. It's also an issue that has become 2 or 3 times more important and contentious because of COVID. When COVID first started spreading, there were a number of attempts in places like Taiwan, China, South Korea, Israel, to use cell phone geolocation data to track users of cell phones who may have contracted COVID. And instantly, there was this conflict between privacy laws that said, don't share that data unless everyone's signed up to do so. And then the public health need to track people who have COVID, make sure they don't spread it. Unfortunately, in most cases, the privacy laws weren't satisfied and the public health needs weren't satisfied because we didn't design a system that met both needs. And this is an area where we actually have a lot of new exciting opportunities to use new business models and new approaches and new contractual arrangements that could actually protect data about me, but also enable data about me to be shared anonymously for all sorts of new applications. But right now, unfortunately, we're in a tug of war between people who say don't collect the data and people who are sucking up as much data as they can and often using it and abusing it without anybody knowing what they're doing. So the question again, for the year 2030, are we going to have a world where we have stricter limits on what data can be collected and why? Or option two, are there going to be even more businesses and governments sucking up even more data, combining it in new ways and abusing it in ways that we'll never understand or realize? That sounds like the only two choices, but there's actually a third choice, and that is that we focus entirely on the most important thing, which is transparency. The European Union has the Global Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation, which does have some very important transparency requirements. And this is, I think, where we need to focus more. I will give companies more data if they tell me what that data is after they've compiled it, and they tell me what they are doing with it. I call it two-way transparency. I'm more transparent about who I am and what I'm doing, but you'd better be sure to tell me what you're doing, how you're securing that data, and give me some control over when and how you might share that with other people for services that I want. This is something that has been developed by Sandy Pentland and his team at MIT. There's quite a few people in Brussels talking about this idea of safe spaces for data about me. It's not just data that I produce. It might be data that a third party collects about me. Some people call these data unions, data cooperatives, data spaces. But the idea is to treat your data about you the same way banks treat your money. I can go to my bank and they can tell me where my money is and who they've sent it to, who's, how much interest I've gotten, the whole idea is they are trusted and they are responsible to me. And that's what a data union would be. The latest issue of the Financial Times includes a very interesting special supplement on AI and digital healthcare. And there's a whole article on data governance that shows exactly how these data unions could work, particularly in the healthcare arena. Let me move on to the fifth topic, which is one that doesn't get a lot of attention, but could be an incredibly powerful force shaping the future of cyber civilization. And that is copyright online. Copyright law has sort of been, in the internet and digital age, has sort of been focused on how people broadcast music and movies. So it's written with Spotify and YouTube in mind. But the truth is, we spend a lot more time talking to people and sending emails. We're in our Zoom room a lot more than unless we're a teenage kid, we're in our Zoom rooms doing Zoom things a lot more than we are listening to Spotify. And so we have to think about how our copyright laws should be modified to let us do in our Zoom room what we do in our living room. If I buy a CD or I download a piece of music, I can listen to that with my friends in my living room, but technically I'm not supposed to do that in my Zoom room because that's broadcasting copyrighted content without permission. So we're going to have to change the way we use copyrighted material. The other really big challenge is that we want to have general artificial intelligence, and that requires giving our algorithms access to as much content as possible. Ideally, the entire Library of Congress times 10, but that's copyrighted. So how do we deal with this new world where we need to have access to more information for the most exciting new opportunities for the digital economy? So the choices are pretty clear. In the year 2030, we'll every bit of copyrighted material be monitored? Will we have systems that block you from using content without authorization? Will there be copyright filters everywhere? And will fair use disappear? Or will we have more and more content in the public domain? Will Wikipedia be the business model of the future? Or, third choice, will more and more business owners figure out ways that they can take their copyrighted content and make it available for free so that they don't have to do so much to control the spread of their content? Let me finish with an issue which should get more attention, and that is digital identity and digital payments. A number of countries are promoting digital identity systems. A few of them even have systems that work pretty well. They're doing this in order to promote and enable e-government services so that you log on once and you can use your ID in any agency. Obviously, this is a great way to prevent online fraud and detect spoofing, and it prevents cyber attacks. Some countries are also developing cryptocurrency and digital cash and other means of online payment. And again, these have to be designed very carefully so users trust them. Trust requires privacy protections that people understand. You have four choices here. One is that digital identity and digital payment systems are designed to ensure the privacy of users. Option two is the one that many governments have chosen, and that is to use digital identity and digital payment systems as a way to monitor the activity of their citizens online. They could do it one person at a time, or they could do mass surveillance, looking at what millions of people are doing to look for criminal activity, terrorism, or the political opposition. The third possibility is that corporations will end up designing the digital identity systems and digital payment systems that we all end up using. And Facebook is trying to do this. Often we use our Apple ID to log on to websites. And then there's the fourth option, which is total confusion, where we have all these different types of identity systems and digital payment systems. Very few of them get critical mass, and nobody trusts any of them because it's not clear which ones actually meet our needs. So let me finish by asking the other big question about the thorny questions. Why are these so thorny? For instance, encryption is an issue we've been arguing with for more than 30 years. One reason, of course, is that different agencies have different priorities. In the case of encryption, agencies who care about cybersecurity and data protection think that ubiquitous end-to-end encryption is a great idea. Law enforcement agencies disagree. So for each of these different thorny questions, there are these kind of conflicts, and they're not one agency's this way and one's 20 degrees different. In a lot of cases, agencies are diametrically opposed, and they're arguing about what the policy should be, and nothing is happening. That's because we don't have enough digital leadership. Digital leadership has to come from the president or the prime minister who can put the needs of the country's citizens in front of the narrower needs of individual agencies or pressure groups. They also have to work hard to find new approaches and better metaphors and better models. I mean, too many people in government are still talking about the internet as if it's the telephone. We wiretap the telephone. Why can't we wiretap everything that happens on the internet? Or they're thinking of the internet as television, broadcast television, cable television, as if it's all about broadcasting to millions of people the same content at the same time. The internet's totally different, but unfortunately, we don't talk about it differently. We keep trying to pretend that this technology can do everything that we've wanted to do, even if we're asking for two things that are mutually contradictory. For instance, data protection authorities have been telling companies to limit how much data they collect and how long they keep it. But then they punish those same companies when they retain data because law enforcement has told them to retain the data. You can't fix that by just nerding harder. You have to allow new approaches, and you have to make choices. You have to decide whether surveillance is more important than enabling the cloud, whether e-government and trusted services is more important than limiting how data flows across your national borders. I've been accused of being a pathological optimist, even a delusional utopian. And when it comes to technology, that's true. But I've spent almost 30 years in Washington, so I know how politics and self-interest can get in the way of progress. My hope is that at least in a few countries, we will have political leaders who can provide the digital leadership needed to find real and effective answers to the thorny questions I've outlined. And I'm hoping that once a few countries have done that and done it well, other countries will pay attention. They will listen and emulate. I'm excited about the new digital agency here in Japan. I'm particularly excited that June Murai is helping design the agency and set its priorities. They could be a focal point. A number of smaller countries, Estonia, Singapore, Israel, have deep digital leadership that is teaching us quite a bit about one or two of the thorny questions. But we've got to take on all 6 of these questions, and we don't have the luxury of time. My dream is that politicians everywhere will adopt the mantra we had at the White House and will strive to first do no harm. And I hope they will also realize that the 4 keys to effective digital policy are competition, innovation, transparency, and empathy. I call them the CITE goals. They are what citizens need. They aren't what agencies need or corporations need. Citizens need choices, they need new services, new approaches, and they need to understand what's happening. And that's where transparency comes in. I hope that you'll join me in seeing how technology and policy can combine to meet these goals. Let's design a cyber civilization that will work for our children and their children. We have the tools, let's make it happen. Thank you very much. Again, wonderful to be here, and I look forward to the conversation.
A very thought-provoking and very interesting talk, and not a big surprise. I was very much looking forward to your thorny questions. You have touched upon a very broad range of questions, and you, in the preparation, you told me that you would like to talk on the very top level, 10,000, 100K feet up in the orbit, that perspective. So I would like to propose, in the sake of time, that we really start with, maybe 3 of these questions with the top level, and then try to nail it down a little bit. And I would say that, the question about internet fragmentation or Splinternet, as you have outlined it, this is probably one of the most urgent, or also one of the top level. Another one that I think goes very closely hand in hand with that question is the question about authentication online, right? How do we identify people and what do we do? And then maybe narrowing down further, it could be the question about privacy. So this is just a proposal how we kind of can structure the conversation. I, of course, invite everyone to comment, because this is a group of friends and long-term collaborators. So whenever there are any questions or general comments or input on Mike's talk, that is very much welcome. But in order to give it a little bit of a structure, maybe I can kick off the conversation and go directly to Professor Murai and Professor Dave Farber about the question of the internet fragmentation. Because I remember, June, we have discussed this question a couple of times in the classes that we have been teaching together, which I miss a lot, by the way, and also in other contexts and conversation. From you, I learned that, the question about the fragmentation of the internet and moving away from the global idea is one of the biggest threats that we currently see. So I was wondering if I could ask you to provide some comment and input first, and maybe we can then go to Dave and hear a little bit from the, the very first beginnings of how this was designed, and if you already had in mind some kind of fragmentation, or if you could see this coming.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Katarina, and thank you very much for Mike for the. Thank you very much, especially giving me a very, very strong pressure to my role on this digital agency, and then line up all the kind of I mean, it's impossible to answer questions, and then giving you a pressure, and thank you very much for all this. And, but anyway, so getting to the Katarina's question about, and then his second question actually was global single internet versus kind of a fragmented internet question. And so this has been of course a long discussion, but it's getting to be much clearer. As all the question, by the way, of Mike's have been kind of there for a long time, but now it's getting to kind of structured. It's a kind of structured question. So it's a yes and no, and then can do and they cannot do type of thing. So this is a very important part. So as the fragmented internet question as well. So when we see the architecture of the internet, then so on the human, I mean, like a civilization, cyber civilization concept, then the internet is the very fast space a human being ever had as a kind of single global, space to work together. So this part is really important. This is very important to keep this space about single global space for all the human being, maybe for the Internet of Things and other context, then the covering the entire planet, which is a very important mission of this technology. So in that sense, I should be, everybody, every single stakeholder should work together to keep this global single entity for the human being and the planet. So this might be the current technology layer 3 IP layer of the internet, maybe. And then so that should be agreed by any entities in this planet. So secondly, then the fragmentation and the other things, it's a local government, national internet type of thing. It's already, because it's a national, so it's already a policy of kind of a segment of the people. So it's like a kind of service segment on the overlaying on top of the global internet. So that's one of the way to view this, which has been happening again in internet history many times. And then so it's really depend on kind of a policy of the services rather than technologies. Therefore, I don't think it's going to be a very difficult issue about the fragmentation versus the global space. Thank you very much. Dave, any input from you on this?
Oh, endless, but I'll keep it short. First of all, the early days of the internet, people thought of it as one space, not a bunch of national spaces. The notions were that we were going to tie together the world, and with removing borders, removing constraints. If you look at what's happened over the last 3 years now with the COVID world, if we had a fragmented internet, we wouldn't have made the progress we did medically. We would have been in serious trouble if countries guarded their secrets. Also, I would point out, and actually in a couple of weeks, I'm going to give a talk on this, that in fact, fragmentation has serious technical problems with almost every implementation that exists. We never built the internet to work that way. And so in fact, it will not work that way. To paraphrase a comment that John Gilmore made a long time ago, the internet routes around censorship. And that's going to happen. It's very, very difficult. I go on forever in this, but I'll keep my mouth short. So.
Thanks. Maybe one immediate observation before we move on and hear from Joey and Jiro. I think, Mike, in your talk, you mentioned in the context of digital leadership, the prime ministers and the presidents. June talked about stakeholders. I'm wondering if, the notion of prime ministers and presidents, kind of necessarily outlines a fragmentation already, because they have been elected to, protect their own country, which is surrounded by national borders, right? Or even worse, they have come into power not by voting, but, by other means. So their mission is probably different. So I think the digital leadership necessarily needs to be a broader topic, right? So we need academia involved, we need the industry involved, we need civil society involved and all of that. But I could also talk forever. So maybe Joey, if you have any comments on that.
If you have all those different players, you're not going to have a deadline and you're not going to force a compromise. Every different group will push its own agenda. The president or the prime minister is elected by the whole country. They have to answer to all the different groups. And that's why I'm saying there needs to be digital leadership and real choices made. You can't have a policy that somehow magically does three things that can't all be done at the same time. I mean, you just can't do that. And what's happening right now is you have presidents and prime ministers abdicating responsibility. And so the parliament and the courts are coming up with different solutions for different problems that don't fit together. And we have a total mess. Encryption's the easy one to understand, but I mentioned earlier a broadband regulation. We just did a study on Korea. They have the most boneheaded broadband regulation. It basically says that the government is going to force all the little networks to pay a subsidy to the three big networks, because the three big networks are powerful. This isn't the prime minister doing what's good for the country. This is the telecommunications ministry doing what's good for the three big telephone companies. Not the right answer.
Right. Thanks.
I've put a few things in the chat with references to the article on the Financial Times and also a reference to the paper we just did on Korean policy.
Lovely. Maybe with that, I can hand over to Joey so that everyone has a chance to speak up here.
So this just riffing off of what Mike just said. I mean, I think one of the problems, I'm looking more specifically at Japan these days, but while we have June supporting the prime minister, and I think it's tremendously important and effective, what I see missing is at the senior policy level, any real technical digital understanding. And I think of, I think back to like the Bauhaus movement, which was an architectural movement that incorporated new materials like steel and machines and mass production. And they completely changed everything from the sensibility to the idea that you can now build skyscrapers. You can build a whole bunch of stuff. So instead of just changing the wooden panels of the old homes to steel, they realized they can build things differently and more safely and all kinds of things. And I think what's happening right now is if you think of all the new technologies like hardware security modules, privacy enhancing technology, tokenized authentication, these are all new materials that you could use just to replace the same materials without changing the architecture. But what you really want to do is you want to build new architecture, and we don't have a master digital architect, and we don't have digital architect people in each of the ministries. And so what happens, and I've been looking at, like, for instance, the digital free flow with trust thing that June is quite involved in, which relates very much to the privacy point that you're making. How do you leverage machine learning while protecting privacy? Most of the people who are on the drafting teams are not technical people. So while there are privacy enhancing technologies discussed at the subcommittee level, and there's a list of them. No one is at the senior level saying, well, instead of trying to create legislature that penalizes people who don't de-anonymize, why don't we come up with things like, use things like zero knowledge proofs or multi-party computation or synthetic data through generative models to just eliminate, or even use differential privacy as a way to measure how private something is, because there's a lot of mathematics and computation that actually makes certain types of legislations not even necessary. And in fact, privacy enhancing technology specifically, I think should be an initiative that's invested in as a new industry and a new field of scholarship, to be a new material that allows policymakers to envision completely new architectures. And so, and this ties, I think, to the last two, which is, I think that the identity discussion, as well as the privacy discussion, could be substantially moved forward with a lot more technical, and the problem is the technical people get it after the policy people. And I think that's one of the problems. So it's like, here's a new law, make it so. So that's one problem. And then the other problem, I think, so I often use the example of putty, Legos, and dollhouses. So dollhouses are the products, okay? So like Bitcoin is a dollhouse. You either like it or you don't like it, and you vote on it, you regulate it. But in fact, Bitcoin is a bunch of different technologies like Legos that are kind of put together by a bunch of people who are designing the product. And those are maybe the engineers. And for the scientists, the cryptographers, and the mathematicians, it's like putty. You could kind of make it do anything, and they're speculating on what would be useful. And then at the end of the day, the regulators say yes or no to the product, instead of civil society and the regulators talking with the people who are making the putty to try to say, well, why don't we envision technology being used to solve this problem or to have this thing? And in order to have that conversation between the scientists and the regulators, you need a literacy on both sides. And this gets back, I think, to what CCRC may be a part of, which is, how do you create liberal arts education for technical people and technical education for liberal arts people, and get them in positions in government and other places where they have an ability to express new architecture, both in policy language as well as in technology. And I think we're making progress. But if I were to answer all of your questions, the meta, which is the incentives to do all this stuff, are all pretty screwed up. And so I'm pretty skeptical about how much progress we're going to make. And I think it's sort of one June Marai at a time, where you have people who go in and push, and some of the smart politicians realizing that supporting these types of maverick leaders is beneficial to the country. But I haven't yet seen, Berkman has contributed to that. There are institutions that have done it, but I still feel like this is still, I feel more pessimistic these days than optimistic in general.
Thanks. Even if you feel pessimistic, you speak very much to my heart, because this topic of interdisciplinarity and the role of liberal arts is something that I think is very important. And it kind of relates to a question that I see in the Q&A session. And maybe we take that before we go to Professor Kukurier, to you, Giro, because it's kind of closely related to that. It's from Rod van Meter. So as a professor, and this question goes to Dave and Mike, I guess, as an educator, what should I be teaching my students these days? Maybe Mike and Dave, if you could very briefly comment on that and give us your opinion, and then we can move on. What should we be teaching? And it goes to me as well, right? I'm also teaching. What should we be teaching?
That requires a 2-semester answer. One of the most interesting things I've done in my career, after leaving IBM, I taught at Georgetown. I intended to teach for 2 years. I ended up teaching full-time for 3.5 in the Communication, Culture, and Technology program. An incredibly broad program. And it taught people to develop 2 or 3 different toolkits. So they had to learn some technology, but they also learned about communication, or they also learned about political science. So they were in that unique position. They were in that small overlap in the Venn diagram that allowed them to do what Joey just said. In some cases, they went into government. Other cases, they went into advocacy groups. A whole lot of them went into consulting at Deloitte or IBM, but they had something nobody else had. They had that ability to go deep in at least 2 different areas. And so that's hard to teach. You really have to get them to do. And often you get them to do by putting them in teams with people who come from other fields. And a lot of my projects, I had a class called What's Shaping the Internet, and another one that was very popular called How to Predict the Futures. And in each case, they had team projects where they had to work for many hours with somebody who thought completely different than they did. The other thing I would encourage them to do, and this is almost the opposite of what most kids are taught. They need to read a book called Micro Style, The Art of Writing Little, 80 pages, tells you how to write very succinctly, high impact sentences. I told all my students, give me a 15-page paper, you get a C. Give me a 5-page paper that has 15 pages of content, you get an A. I mean, that's the way we need to teach people to write. And that's probably the most important thing I taught my students.
Great, thanks. Dave, anything to add on that?
Oh, yeah. Throughout my academic career, I've always had to face the problem of rigid programs. If you look at most engineering schools, they have a full collection of engineering topics. And so if you want them to spread out and teach other things, teach liberal arts subjects, or teach stuff like Mike teaches, taught, you have real problems. It doesn't fit. And that's particularly, my observation is that's particularly a problem in Japan, at least my vision of it, that kids basically have such a packed program and a desire to get their credits that in fact they don't budge outside their field. When I was at Penn, one of the things we did there was we took Wharton, which is a well-known business school, where the people had no notion in the world of technology. And yet these were the people who were going to go out and be involved in technology. And we did two things. One is we had obligatory classes within Wharton, introductory classes, so the people knew what technology was like. And the other thing, which turned out to be very, very good, and I assume it's still there, is that we had a 5-year program for engineers where basically they left with a engineering degree and an MBA. And those people did very, very well because they knew the technology, they knew the business problems, they knew how to present things. That's something we have to encourage. I don't think it's done enough as far as I can tell in many countries. I don't see it happening that much in Japan, although there's SFC campus helps a lot on that. But still, it needs pushing because our politicians don't understand technology and most technologists don't understand politics.
Yeah, SFC helps a lot. We will continue to push. Since we are running out of time is always so limited. So I would like to give Jiro an opportunity to comment on, what has been said before, or, the few questions that we have highlighted here.
Well, thanks, Mike, for the great talk, and thank you for Katarina for giving the opportunity to speak a little bit. I think we are unanimous in wanting to maintain, to prevent fragmentation. I think we are unanimous in wanting to connect everybody and all the data for good uses. And probably what we should think about is how to do it. And I raised this because one of the people who are asking, George Sadowski, I hope I'm pronouncing right, in the Q&A box, is asking this question whether this is a binary decision, whether it should be a binary decision. And I think that's we need to address that because there are legitimate concerns on the uses of internet. Something that anybody, like child pornography, just to give one example, or money laundering and criminal activities, and that sort of things. And also the should we give room for regional or cultural dependent sensitivities to be considered. I mean, can we only have one single internet with one single rules and ethics? Is a big question. And June sort of answered part of the question by suggesting overlay network. And Joy suggested sort of a more of an algorithmic approach. So perhaps I should ask Dave, I mean, can we solve this with these technologies?
There's a lot of technology we could use, and I think that's what Joey is aiming at. We've developed a lot of very good technology over the past 10 years that enables us to do better security, better protection, better identity management, etc. Very little of it is used right now, and that's a combination of a very complicated system where it's very hard to put things in without breaking everything, and a system which was designed 40 years ago. And in a world where things change overnight, we now have we're sitting on a technological system which is almost obsolete. And that presents an interesting problem. But yes, there are many, many technologies that can be used by policy people and technologists and business people to produce better trust, better identity management, better security, better privacy. And very, very little of it is ever used.
And when countries start picking different technologies for different, I mean, for their own purposes, won't we end up being fragmented? Anyway.
Yes. You see that quite a bit with a country whose name I will not mention, tweaking their encryption system, their base encryption system, to make it very difficult to get cross-border communication. Again, technology can be used to remove barriers or to make barriers. One big problem with a lot of the problems we have now is that we have no way of really knowing where anything comes from.
Yeah, in that sense, policy layer people started to talk about the supply chain issues on a kind of technological framework, which is should be very much we should be very careful about kind of very much strong move about that kind of discussion. I mean, supply chain thing. It's kind of because that is discussed by the national security people and the trade people, but mostly the people who are not very much familiar with kind of the technological semantics of the internet very much. And one more things to add is about the other questions, getting back to the Mike's discussion. And then probably the common issue is lack of understanding about how that internet works, and then also what is a cyberspace type of things from the policy leader area. And then that's getting better and better, of course. And especially the optimistic part is that during the COVID-19, they learned a lot. I mean, many people learned a lot about the kind of impact of the digital technology and the internet impact. And so it gets much better than 3 years ago type of thing, which is good. But at the same time, the most of the discussions you raised, Mike, really because of the they don't understand digital leadership. And I'm going to get into this one country, and then so the top person need to be understood, but then it's always necessary to convince the kind of democratic way for the before cyber civilization and after cyber civilization situations. So, which is always very important task, and that so well, we should work as this laboratory to work on.
I would add one more thing, though. We've stressed a lot on cluelessness, But there's another really important problem, and that is that too many people want to control things.
Uh-huh.
The power of the internet is that no one's in control and everyone's in control. I mean, billions of people are making choices about what technology they use, what websites they go to, and that allows the internet to evolve. And there are these people who want to control it for their own purposes. They want to restrict what services are offered so they can make more money, or so that they can control their citizens. Somehow we have to keep pushing for an internet that is people powered, not government designed.
How can we address this from a policy perspective? I assume people would expect that this could be a technology perspective, but I don't think so. I think it's something that we need to
democracies, it
design.
means voters who vote for a better internet. And I'm excited about this. There are now national campaigns for the presidency in countries where digital issues are on the ballot. I mean, the president or the prime minister is advocating for a particular solution. And I mean, Modi is very, very controversial, but in India, they have a digital authentication system for 1 billion people.
Yeah, that is also the matter of the tide, kind of, what kind of interests everybody has, right? So I said the COVID-19 made a big change because everybody was thinking about the global health, right? And then when the global health issue coming, and then there's a lot of areas to agree for the, to move the digital technology and the global space forward. So it's like, in Japan, for example, then, it's a very easy and comfortable discussion of the internet. It's always happening when the disaster, natural disaster, earthquake and happen, and then the people wants to help the people's life, and then they're working together. Various segments of the people used to be, conflicting each other, but now they have to work together for this issue. So this time, I feel a little bit comfortable in terms of working together on the internet for the people type of a thing. So this kind of area, discussion area specification, like a health, a disaster or the planet type of things, always works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks so much. Maybe Joey, if you want to give some comments, and then we hand over to Dave and Mike for final closing comments, because the time is, I think, already running out.
I don't really have that much to add. I mean, I think that what June and Mike and everybody has said. I guess the one last thing I would maybe add is, I talked about this with Dave early on, but I think the people who joined the internet recently can't imagine the internet being different. But the people like you who are there from the beginning know that a lot of the decisions that were made are kind of arbitrary, and so can imagine a different decision. And so some of the fundamental architecture changes that might promote some of the changes that we want are not people don't seem to have permission to ask those questions. And so before this generation retires, I think it's sort of the obligation of this generation to go back and say, wait, what are we all doing here again? And ask some of the bigger questions that I don't feel like the new engineers seem to have permission to do. And kind of having that conversation as an extension of this, I think, would be valuable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. It's kind of interesting how young people see all of this being there for granted, right? And not questioning why this is happening and what has been done to make this happen. That's an interesting observation. Dave, do you want to provide any final comments, or?
Just to amplify Joey's comment a little bit. In the early days, we made decisions based on, oh, well, what the hell? There's only 20 or 30 people involved. And there was most people did not have the vision that we were going to take over the world. So it was a research project. As a research project, you sort of park some stuff away. And some of the stuff you parked away has been considered by the younger generation to be scripture. You're not supposed to do those things. You can't. And that's, I reinforce Joey's comment that there has to be more communication on what the basic ideas are as opposed to what serendipity sort of created. And Mike, thank you very, very much. That was a wonderful talk.
Great discussion.
And
Yes.
I have to apologize. I forgot in the beginning, we didn't do the round of introduction because for me, this group is so well known and I always assume that there needs to be no introduction, but I realize now that we have an official conference. So Sherry, if you want to do a quick round of introduction so that people know who has been speaking. Otherwise, I would say everything is available on our website, and I'm very happy to be part of this conference and also of the CCRC. So I look forward to the next opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So maybe just a quick one. We thank Katharina Markey. She's an associate professor at Graduate School for Media and Governance at Keio University. And then we have Professor June Melange. He's also the co-director of CCRC and the distinguished professor at Keio University. Professor Gio Cockrell, he's the chief administrator at CCRC and professor at Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University. And lastly, thank you to Joito. He's the research member at CCRC and the director at the Center for Radical Transformation at Chiba Institute of Technology. Thank you all again for the amazing discussion.
Thank you very much.